In the spring of 1887, in the orderly frontier town of Harmony Creek, a woman made a choice that stripped a man of his future in a single, quiet moment. Eleanor Vance, 32 and respected, opened her door to Caleb Morris, a 40-year-old laborer who had crossed 2 territories with everything he owned tied into 2 saddlebags. They had exchanged letters for nearly 9 months, planning a shared life. But when Caleb removed his hat on her porch, Eleanor stepped back and rejected him, not for debt, not for dishonor, but for the simple fact that he was bald, saying she would not know how to explain him. His promised future was withdrawn in full daylight, for a reason as small as appearance. But what Eleanor didn't know was that a quiet shopkeeper named Matilda Jennings, who had never spoken against the town in her life, would see Caleb not as an embarrassment, but as a man worth standing beside. And when the town tried to let him leave without consequence, Matilda would choose him openly, publicly, and without apology. This is their story, a tale of a man the world dismissed as diminished, and the woman who proved his worth was never tied to what he lacked, but to who he was. It was the spring of 1887 when Caleb Morris rode into Harmony Creek, road dust still clinging to his coat and boots, the long miles written in the careful way he sat his horse. The town lay open beneath a wide sky, its buildings arranged with quiet confidence, as if everything already belonged exactly where it stood. Harmony Creek was not a place that questioned itself. It measured, it judged, and then it moved on. Caleb slowed his horse at the edge of the main street. He did not rush. He had learned long ago that hope could be startled if approached too quickly. He took in the hitching posts, the clean storefronts, the steady pace of people who knew one another's names. This was not a frontier clinging to survival. This was a town that expected permanence. In his saddlebag were letters tied with twine, the paper softened from handling. Eleanor Vance's handwriting was neat and deliberate. She wrote of steadiness, of wanting a life built on reliability rather than passion alone. She wrote that she admired a man who listened more than he spoke, who understood that partnership was not a performance but a practice. Caleb had answered honestly. He told her of his work, the way he planned his days, the small pleasures he allowed himself sparingly. He did not describe his appearance. It had not occurred to him to do so. He described his character instead, believing, perhaps foolishly, that this was what mattered most. He had sold his tools to afford the journey, given up the room he rented, left behind the familiar weight of solitude he had learned to live with. Everything he brought fit into 2 saddlebags and a small tin box of keepsakes he had not yet decided what to do with. When he reached Eleanor's street, he dismounted and tied his horse. He adjusted his hat, straightened his coat, and took a measured breath. He was not nervous, he was prepared. There was a difference. The house was modest and clean, its porch swept as if expectation itself had passed through that morning. Caleb stepped forward and knocked once. When the door opened and Eleanor Vance appeared, her expression was polite, composed, expectant. Caleb smiled. For one brief moment, the future still stood before him, whole and unbroken. Eleanor stepped fully into the doorway, her hand resting lightly against the frame. She looked at Caleb with the careful attention of someone verifying a long-held assumption. The moment stretched, just long enough to be felt. Caleb reached up and removed his hat. The air shifted. It was not sudden. It was precise. Eleanor's eyes moved to his uncovered head and stopped there, not in shock, not in disgust, but in recalculation. Her expression did not harden. Instead, it grew distant, as if she were quietly stepping backward from a decision already made. "I don't think," she said at last, lowering her voice, "that this is what I agreed to." Caleb remained still, hat in hand. He did not rush to fill the space. "We exchanged letters," she continued, glancing briefly past him toward the street. A few townspeople passed within earshot, their pace unbroken. I believed I knew who was coming. You do, Caleb said. His voice was even, not defensive, not pleading. Eleanor shook her head slowly. No, I don't think I do. She hesitated, then gestured, lightly, almost apologetically, toward his head. I wouldn't know how to explain this, she said. People would ask questions. The words were spoken gently. That was what made them final. Caleb felt understanding settle before pain arrived. He replaced his hat with steady hands. The gesture was deliberate, like closing a door rather than slamming it. I see, he said. Eleanor shifted, discomfort flickering across her face. Perhaps she had expected anger, or argument, or shame made visible. I wish you well, she said, already retreating. Caleb inclined his head. Thank you for your honesty. The door closed behind her. No one laughed. No one spoke. The porch boards creaked as Caleb stepped away, each sound carrying farther than it should have. He walked past the lingering eyes without looking at them, crossed the street, and continued on. Hope did not shatter. It folded inward, clean, devastating, and quiet, leaving behind the hollow knowledge that something promised had been withdrawn in full daylight. And Harmony Creek watched, uncertain whether it had just witnessed rejection or something far more revealing. Caleb did not leave Harmony Creek that afternoon. He reached the end of Eleanor's street after tying his horse near the livery and kept walking, his boots carrying him forward while his thoughts lagged behind, still trying to catch up with what had already happened. The town continued around him as if nothing at all had occurred. That, more than anything, unsettled him. A hammer rang against iron at the blacksmith's shop. Children darted between buildings, their laughter sharp and unguarded. A woman crossed the street with a basket balanced on her hip, nodding politely without recognition. Life did not pause for a man whose future had just been quietly withdrawn. Caleb became aware of eyes on him, not openly curious, not cruel. Assessing. People looked once, then looked away, as if acknowledging something they did not yet have language for. He felt himself becoming a story already in the process of being edited. He sat on a bench near the livery and removed his hat again, setting it beside him. The sun warmed his scalp, but the heat did not reach his chest, where something tight and unfamiliar had settled, fatigue mistaken for shame. He did not lower his head. He would not be the one to make this moment smaller. He thought of the letters, of how carefully words could construct an image that lived comfortably in the imagination. He had written honestly. Still, he understood now how much could be assumed between the lines. Eleanor had wanted a future that fit cleanly into the town's expectations. He did not fit the shape she had pictured. The road out of Harmony Creek lay open, wide and forgiving. Leaving would cost him nothing further. Staying would cost him dignity, unless he chose carefully where to place it. He rose as the afternoon light shifted. His horse remained tied where he had left it, patient and unconcerned. Caleb laid a hand briefly against its neck, grounding himself in something solid and familiar. He did not mount. Instead, he led the horse down the street, past the last houses, and toward the general store near the bend in the road. Light spilled through its open door, warm against the encroaching evening. Caleb slowed, considering. Then he stepped inside. Without knowing it, he crossed the first threshold that would not reject him. The bell above the door chimed softly as Caleb entered the general store, a small, unremarkable sound that nonetheless announced him. The space smelled of grain, soap, and wood. Clean, practical scents. Shelves stood neatly stocked. Nothing was rushed here. Nothing wasted. Behind the counter, Matilda Jennings looked up from her ledger. She took him in without pause. His dust-worn coat. The careful way he stood as if prepared to leave at the first sign of dismissal. Her eyes flicked briefly to his hat, then returned to his face. She did not linger. "There's water in the back," she said evenly, nodding toward a barrel near the storeroom. "Help yourself." Caleb did. He drank slowly, letting the coolness settle more than just his thirst. When he returned the cup, Matilda was already lifting a crate from the floor. "If you're looking for work," she said, adjusting her grip, "those need stacking. I pay by the hour." There was no question attached, no curiosity disguised as kindness, just an offer, clean and sufficient. "Yes," Caleb said. "That would help." They worked in silence. Crates moved from floor to shelf. Grain sacks shifted. Dust settled. The ordinary rhythm of labor pressed back against the strangeness of the day. Caleb focused on the weight in his hands, the simple logic of one task following another. Matilda did not watch him work. That, too, was a choice. When the last crate was stacked, she consulted her ledger, counted out his pay, and slid it across the counter. "You're welcome back tomorrow," she said, "if you want." Caleb closed his fingers around the coins. He hesitated, then spoke. "Thank you." She nodded once, already returning to her ledger. As Caleb stepped back outside, the light had softened into evening. The town looked the same, but he did not. Harmony Creek had not opened itself to him, but one door had stayed open, and sometimes that was enough to keep a man standing. Caleb stayed. He rose before the town fully stirred, the air still cool enough to carry the scent of damp earth. He took the work others passed over without complaint. Fence lines stretched thin and crooked. Timber left too heavy for convenience, ground that resisted the shovel, as if it had something personal to say. He worked steadily, without flourish. He did not announce himself. He did not linger where conversation gathered. He showed up, finished what he started, and moved on to the next task. At first, the town responded with silence. That was expected. Silence had become familiar. But silence, when held long enough against consistency, begins to shift. Men who once avoided his eyes now nodded once in passing. Women who had stepped around him in the street slowed their pace, as if recalibrating their assumptions. No one apologized. No one explained. Harmony Creek was not a town that revisited its judgments aloud. Caleb noticed the change without acknowledging it. He had learned not to mistake recognition for acceptance. He kept his head level and his work clean. He returned often to Matilda's store, sometimes for paid labor, sometimes to purchase supplies. Conversation remained spare, but something unspoken settled into place between them. A mutual understanding that did not require inspection. One evening, as he stacked crates in the back, Matilda spoke without looking up from her ledger. "You don't owe anyone an explanation," she said. Caleb paused only long enough to register the words. "I know. They may want one anyway." "I won't give it," he said. Not defiant, certain. Matilda nodded once. "Good." Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the sound of distant work being finished for the day. Caleb stepped back into the street with the familiar weight of labor in his arms, and something steadier beginning to form in his chest. Still, the wound had not healed. It had only quieted, waiting. Matilda Jennings watched the town as carefully as she kept her accounts. She noticed how Caleb moved through Harmony Creek without claiming space, how he worked as if ready to be done and gone at a moment's notice. She saw the way people adjusted around him, small, almost reluctant shifts that betrayed an unspoken reevaluation. She also saw what he did not allow himself to show. Caleb never lingered at the end of a job, never stayed where conversation softened. He carried himself like a man on borrowed ground, careful not to presume permanence. Even when respect crept in, he did not reach for it. Matilda understood restraint. She had built her business on it. As a woman alone in a town that valued certainty, she had learned how quickly opinion could turn. Speaking out was rarely rewarded. Silence, properly managed, could keep a person solvent. More than once she caught herself watching Caleb longer than necessary, not out of interest in his appearance but in his composure, in the way he bore pressure without bending toward bitterness. She opened her mouth to speak, once, twice, and closed it again. Words could cost her trade. Aligning herself openly with him could cost more than she could afford. So she waited. But waiting, she knew, was also a choice. When the rumor began to circulate that Eleanor Vance intended to take her grievance to the church council, Matilda felt the ground shift beneath something she had carefully kept balanced. This would not remain quiet, and soon, silence would no longer be neutral. The summons came on a Sunday, carried quietly through town as such things often were. No announcement, no spectacle. Just word passed from one person to the next until it reached Caleb, where he was mending a fence at the edge of a field. The church council wished to speak with him. Caleb listened without interruption, nodded once, and returned to his work until the last rail was set straight. Only then did he gather his tools and walk back toward town. He did not rush. He did not delay. The matter would be faced on its own terms. The meeting was held in the church hall, the long benches arranged in a half-circle that suggested deliberation rather than judgment, though the difference was often academic. Sunlight filtered through narrow windows, dust motes hanging in the air like things waiting to be named. Eleanor Vance sat near the front, composed and prepared. When invited to speak, she rose smoothly. She did not accuse. She explained. She spoke of misunderstanding, of correspondence that had created expectations, of embarrassment suffered publicly through no fault of her own. Her voice was calm, even sympathetic, as if she regretted the necessity of the conversation itself. "I was deceived," she said gently, "and I believe the community deserves better than confusion like this." She paused, then added carefully, "It would be kinder for everyone if this were settled now, cleanly." No one interrupted her. In Harmony Creek, letters were not promises of love, but they were promises of intention, and intention carried weight. That was what now sat between them, heavier than any accusation. Caleb stood when called upon. He felt the familiar weight return, not sharper than before, but heavier for being sanctioned. This was no longer a private wound. It had been formalized. He could defend himself. He could recount every honest word he had written. But something in him resisted the idea of arguing for his right to stand where he already stood. As he drew breath to speak, a chair scraped softly against the floor. Matilda Jennings rose from her seat. The sound was small. The effect was not. The room stilled. That night, Caleb packed. He did it methodically, without hurry or anger, folding shirts, wrapping his few keepsakes in cloth before setting them into the tin box. The act was not defeat. It was clarity. He had stayed as long as dignity allowed. He would not be escorted out by judgment, nor remain where his presence required justification. If the town wished to remember him only as the man Eleanor had refused, he would not linger to argue the point. Outside, the wind moved through the grass with the sound of something passing on. Across town, Matilda stood alone in her store long after the last customer had gone. The ledger lay open before her, numbers unfinished. She stared at them without seeing. She knew what the council would likely do if left unchallenged. Harmony Creek preferred resolution over truth, silence over discomfort. Letting a man leave quietly was easier than admitting a wrong had been done. Matilda closed the ledger. She thought of Caleb's restraint, of how carefully he had placed himself, never asking the town to move around him. She thought of how often silence had protected her, and how often it had asked her to look away. When she finally locked the door, the night air felt sharper than it should have. She stood there, key still in hand, understanding that by morning, the choice would be made, with or without her voice. Some decisions announce themselves. Others wait, patient and demanding, until a person finally understands that not choosing is still a choice.